So, Dr. Daigneault, very glad to have you with us tonight to give this talk. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting and informative. So, as I started to say, Dr. Daigneault is with the School of Forest Resources with the University of Maine. He received his BA degree in Economics and Environmental Studies from Denison University, his MA in Economics from Ohio State, his PhD in Environmental and Natural Resource Economics also from Ohio State. Dr. Daigneault joined the School of Forest Resources faculty in 2016 and currently is the E.L. Giddings Associate Professor of Forest Policy and Economics and is head of the University of Maine Forest Policy and Economics Lab. He received his PhD in Environmental and Natural Resource Economics from Ohio State in 2006 and has spent the past decade developing quantitative models to assess the socioeconomic impacts of environmental policy on the natural resource sectors. His research has focused on a wide range of issues, including freshwater management, climate change mitigation and adaptation, invasive species control, and valuing ecosystem services. Prior to joining the School of Forest Resources, Dr. Daigneault was a senior economist at Land Care Research, New Zealand's leading institute on terrestrial ecosystems and biodiversity research, and was an economist for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he worked extensively on policy analysis relating to climate change, biofuels, and land use change. He also is a faculty fellow at the Senator George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainable Solutions and affiliated faculty with the UMaine School of Economics and Ecology and Environmental Sciences program. Adam also is a native Mainer who grew up on the mid-coast, returned home after 18 years living and working in Ohio, Oregon, Washington, D.C., India, and New Zealand. And see, they all come back. Everybody comes back to Maine. Everybody comes back almost. They know where a good place is to live. So he's also an avid endurance athlete, makes the best of Maine by running, biking, and skiing in the university's abundant trail network. So with that, if I don't stop now, he won't have any time to talk. So Adam, please proceed. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thanks for the invitation to this. As he eventually got to the best part or whatever, the best connection is, most of my formative years were spent growing up on the East Coast, including born in first 5 or 6 of my years were right in Warren, so right down the street from Barrie, and then high school in Boothbay. So I had some good connections to Knox and Lincoln County that took me a while to figure out how to get back, but I've been back for about 6 years now and not regretting one moment of that. So I guess I'm going to just kick off the panel. We're all talking today about Maine forestry and forest carbon. And so sort of Barrie, Tracy and I sort of got together and said, what can we do to sort of engage this group in terms of thinking in this space. So I'm going to sort of do sort of the science aspect and some of the sort of work we're thinking about in terms of what the potential that Maine can potentially do to enhance our carbon stocks and sequestration potential in the forest. And then I'll pass it over to Barrie and Tracy to get, basically put all this academic stuff that I'm going to spout off into the real world context. So I think it's going to be a great mix. So with that, let's see if I can get this going. And should be able to see my screen now, right? And let's see this place. All right. Are we seeing something now that says carbon and natural climate solutions potential for Maine's forests? Awesome. I got some thumbs up. All right. So the first thing I just want to touch upon, where the title of my talk has this kind of a new buzzword, which is called natural climate solutions. And what that really means is just basically anything that can focus on conserving, restoring, or improving the use of management of forests, wetlands, grasslands, ag land, really anything in our sort of natural and working land state that basically is simultaneously increasing carbon storage, so we're increasing our stocks, or we're avoiding greenhouse gas emissions, thereby reducing the amount of emissions that can come from basically the land that we're doing there. And on the forest aspect of thing, that's really has to do with protecting forests, so keeping forests as forests, with the forest that we do have, managing timberlands better so forest can grow faster, healthier, and produce sort of greater yields. Or we can restore forest, which is really just a fancy word again for taking land that might have historically been forested and coming up with ways to basically reforest or afforest that. So, we all know it's kind of hard not to drive around Maine and recognize that there's a lot of forests. Something like 89% of our actual land base is forested itself. And if you sort of run the numbers, I'm just going to get right to the punchline now. Our forests store a lot of carbon, and year on year, at least what's happening now is that they're growing a lot faster than what we're removing from them, which means that year on year that amount of sequestration is increasing, and such to the point that annually, the Maine's forests are basically removing about 2/3 of the amount, the emissions that are coming from fossil fuels in terms of the transportation sector and the electricity sector and things that are actually emitting greenhouse gases on a year-to-year basis. And if you just actually go and just add up all the carbon that's sort of standing in our forests right now and the soils beneath it, there's 7.3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's about 400 times of Maine's annual greenhouse gas emissions. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting that much more every single year, but it just indicates how much that stock is out there, how big of a carbon sort of reservoir we have as a result of all those trees growing across the landscape. So I'm going to keep using these words that are either carbon storage or carbon sequestration. And so just before I dive into that too much, I just want to get at what the difference is between the two and recognize sort of where is carbon stored. So where is carbon stored in the forest? It's really these different types of pools. And primarily in the Northeast forests or in Maine's forests, an average acre has about 39% of the carbon is in the above ground trees. So that's the stuff we can actually see, the growing stock. 37% is actually the carbon stored in the soil beneath the surface. And then the roughly sort of remaining 25% or so is coming in things like the forest floor, down in deadwood, and other aspects of sort of the forest ecosystem. But really, like the huge chunk of it's coming from either what's growing above the ground or what's been stored in our soils. That really, I keep talking about storage. So that's sort of if you went and took a snapshot across the landscape, that's what we mean. That's where we get that 700, basically billion ton type question, or 7 billion ton point. But when we want to look at things year on year, we really want to talk about this thing called sequestration. So storage is just a way to take a snapshot across the landscape at any given time. The more trees in the forest, the bigger the trees, the more storage you're going to have. But if we look at a snapshot this year, then next year, then the year after that, sort of each annual change is really what looking at that change in that stock, or what we call sequestration, which is the process of actually removing the carbon from the atmosphere for use in photosynthesis and resulting in the maintenance and growth of plants and trees. So it's the amount that those trees are growing year on year, right? That's the additional sequestration. And that's the key measure that we're using to look at how much the forest compares to an annual emissions that are coming from the transportation sector, from the electric. The other thing that we really don't want to forget about as well is that, often we think about forests and we think about the ecosystem and the growing trees and the amount of carbon that's there. But there's also, when you cut the trees down, the carbon doesn't immediately disappear. And what it does is it transfers to another pool, and that pool is harvested wood products. About 30% of what we actually cut, the carbon that is in the wood and the limbs and the different aspects there, about 30% of that actually gets stored in products over the sort of long term, right? So just cutting down a tree doesn't mean that everything gets emitted back to the atmosphere. About 30% of that can get put into things like furniture, lumber, paper, and other sort of pulp-based products. All that sort of has carbon because it's still being stored at some point. It's just not in the woods. It's now being stored in our homes. So another key aspect to think about. So now I kind of want to just go sort of give a review of sort of where Maine's emissions and sort of sequestration sources are coming from, and sort of where we stand today. And this is going to be important because it's sort of building upon why we need to think about various sort of state level goals of enhancing carbon sequestration coupled with reducing greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate climate. So all these figures I'm going to show are sort of changes over the past sort of 30 years or so in terms of emissions. So right now, I just want to note that basically we're going to have this black line, which is going to indicate anything above that black line is emission. So that's something that's basically creating greenhouse gases. Anything below that axis is going to be what we call a sequestration or sink, and that's sort of removing carbon from the atmosphere, or carbon dioxide. This is Maine's gross greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this is coming primarily from fossil fuels. It peaked at around 26 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, down right now close to sort of 17 or 18. So that's sort of what we're measuring when when we say we really want to reduce greenhouse gases. It's about how much can we continue to lower this blue line. Oops. Now, on the sequestration side, our forest carbon ecosystem, so the stuff you see around the landscape, is continuing to grow. And by basically in the time frame over the last 30 years in terms of the growth, what that has done is actually led to recently we're removing close to 10 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year from the atmosphere from these growing forests. In addition, I talked about those harvested wood products. We've had a relatively steady flow of wood products over time, and so that's been sequestering between 3 and 4 million metric tons of carbon per year as well. And if you add up the wood products and the forest ecosystem, that gets us closer to our sort of 12 or 13 million metric tons that are being sort of sequestered as a result of the forest sector in Maine year on year. And so what we can do now is we can add up this blue line, which is the gross greenhouse gas emissions, along with this green line, which is the total forest sector carbon that we're basically collecting or sequestering year on year. And that allows us to get this net greenhouse gas emissions, which is roughly around just 5 million metric tons in Maine. And so collectively, that also means that basically Maine's forests and forest sector together are removing about 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are being produced year on year by fossil fuels in Maine. All right, so that's a huge number. If you look at that compared to everywhere else in the US, Maine is about third in terms of the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions that our forests remove, slightly behind Mississippi and Oregon, other sort of forest heavy states. So what that all means is that basically we recognize we have a huge stock out there. That stock is continuing to sort of increase, which means we're getting more and more sequestration year on year, right? Which is helping to remove greenhouse gases that are being emitted from other sectors of the economy, right? Which suggests that as we want to continue to move forward, we want to find ways to keep that forest sink basically strong and continue to remove greenhouse gas emissions. And so this figure here is just showing historically, sort of this is a replication of what I just showed. But now there's certain goals that that the state of Maine has set about where we want to be over the next sort of 30 years or so. So that's what we're looking at here. And so there's sort of two main goals that Maine is that we're really trying to work towards. One is that if you focus on this greenhouse gas emissions, right, we want to be 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, all right, and 45% below 1990 by 2030. Sort of currently we're sort of already below our 2020 goal, which is 20% below 1990. But we also, the governor in 2019 released an executive order that set a goal that we want to be basically carbon zero or carbon neutral by 2045, which means that this blue line has to be below the x-axis by 2045. And the idea here is that if we continue on the trajectory of reducing our emissions, and we keep Maine's forests basically sequestering the same amount, sort of same rate of sequestration that we've had sort of over the last 5 years or so, consistent over time, Maine should easily make that net greenhouse gas emission target. But the key thing is that it may not be inevitable that Maine's forests are going to continue what they're doing. So we still have to think about new ways to sort of manage new and additional ways to manage our forests to ensure that we continue to sort of grow them in a healthy manner and sequester carbon more and more. So the rest of the talk is sort of about ways that we can think about getting there and how much more carbon we could potentially sequester as a result. As I noted, there was one executive order that the Governor Mills put out in September of 2019, and that was to establish that 2045 carbon zero goal. There was also an executive order put out earlier this year that was to establish what we call the governor's task force on creation of a forest carbon program, which is the idea to build off some of this work and find ways to actually help achieve that net zero goal. Myself, I'm on the task force, as is Barrie. Tracy isn't formally on the task force, but has done a lot in contributing sort of formally and informally in the process as well. So we can all sort of weigh in on sort of some different aspects of what that process has been. The key is that sort of the group first convened in February of 2021. We've met about 10 times. We have just reviewed close to 100 pages of public comments that have been submitted, of which most were relatively positive about the direction that our recommendations are going in. And the final report is due to the governor on November 1st, so just around the corner. So when we're trying to think about what exactly Maine's forest can do, there's sort of some questions that we can consider. And these are ones that I'm just going to sort of elaborate on for the rest of the talk. So the first is just sort of what natural climate solution practices are actually appropriate for Maine's forests, right? And so there's certain ways that Maine's forests grow and are managed that might be more advantageous to do certain things over others. The second is, if we sort of go through and do these practices, how much more carbon can we be sequestered in our forests and harvested wood products? And third, is it possible to jointly increase both carbon and timber supply? The other thing that often people think about, well, if you want to just get more carbon on the landscape, just don't cut any trees, right? But we also have to understand that management, one, is a key part of the sort of climate solution. And two, if you if you stop cutting trees, you're going to have a negative impact on a lot of sort of forest dependent economies. And there's nothing to prevent basically what we call leakage, is basically someone in New Hampshire or New Brunswick or Quebec basically cutting down a bunch of trees to supply to Maine's mills, right? And then therefore you're not actually having much benefit to overall climate objectives, because you're still basically just cutting trees somewhere else. So really what you do is find management to grow the trees larger, faster, healthier, right? Which can feed both our carbon goals as well as the needs of the forest economy. So some practices that we're going to consider. One is avoided deforestation or conversion. Another one is this idea of afforestation or reforestation of previously forested lands that haven't been around forested for a while. Conservation or permanent set-asides, acknowledging that ecological reserves are part of the sort of mix of solutions. Extending rotations, as well as sort of improved plantations and improved forest management. So to do that, the other thing too is that, as Mark noted, I'm sort of primarily trained as an economist. So while I bring in a lot of aspects of sort of biophysical processes and ecological processes behind how sort of forests grow, right? I also want to think about, is it sort of cost effective, or is it a good use of our sort of limited resources to emphasize or focus on how we can manage our forests from that perspective? So I also want to think about the benefits and costs of doing these different practices, right? And so the costs you want to think about are sort of, what are the opportunity costs or going in and changing sort of how you're managing the forest. And so this could be changes in growth and yield. In some cases, that could be reductions, as well as the harvestable area and products associated with that. There might have labor, capital equipment, or maintenance costs associated with that. And there could be other environmental costs. So it's that maybe some of the practices that you're conducting could change the sort of habitat that's preferable, or lead to different types of sort of runoff or other aspects that you might want to think about when managing the forest. But with that, we're even considering these because there's a number of benefits that could accrue as a result. So you could have increased carbon sequestration, which is the primary goal of these sort of natural climate solutions. You could have yield improvements. If there's sort of markets that basically are incentivizing or paying you for this additional carbon, you could have diversified income. There could be cost savings associated with doing different practices compared to the status quo. You might actually have healthier stands, which could lead to increased value. And there could be other environmental co-benefits as well. So to do this, what we've done is basically developed sort of a series of models and analyses at the University of Maine to sort of look at how can we quantify what might happen if you sort of change the landscape to have a higher proportion of some of those practices that I mentioned implemented across Maine. And one of the big analyses that we've done involved using a forest landscape model to sort of look at how conditions could change across northern Maine over the next sort of 80, 90 years under different climatic conditions and sort of different sort of economic conditions that are associated with implementing those practices. So the key thing too is that what we really want to start with before we're looking at sort of any changes is we need to understand what the baseline is or the business as usual. So where are we before we start to implement all these sort of changes across the landscape? Because that's what we're really trying to measure is you want to measure the additional benefit or the additional cost relative to sort of continuing with the status quo. And so the status quo today would be basically if you sort of take a snapshot of Maine's forests as they stand now in terms of different sort of species distributions and age classes and sort of management regimes that people are implementing, and just sort of let that continue indefinitely into the future. And so some assumptions that we've sort of done to sort of assume that is that roughly about 2.5% of Maine's managed forests are harvested each year. When that land is harvested, about 90% of it is a partial harvest, which means you're just doing selective cuttings. And 10% is basically more of a full sort of harvest clear cut. Most of the stands that are sort of have any sort of intensity of harvesting, the sort of average stand age of a tree in the stand is about 50 years. And we also want to try to look at sort of having consistent flow of timber as a result, because that's sort of a key objective of why sort of we manage woodlots here. So what we can do is sort of run the model and then plot out what's going to look like. And so this figure, really what I want to just sort of point out is the bar charts are showing the sort of change in annual sort of decadal harvest of different species. So you can sort of see some species are being harvested more than others over time. And the other thing is that sort of harvests are peaking around 2050, 2060. But if you sort of follow the sort of stand conditions we're expecting in Maine and continue to just get at that sort of 2.5% of harvest and removing a certain, about 50% of the biomass, you actually could see harvest go down. And the reason partially that's happening is that our stands could potentially, if we follow that regime, could actually not be could basically be removing more than what those stands are growing, which means our carbon stock could actually potentially go down unless we change some of our behaviors, right? And so that's the key thing to think about. Just because we have a lot of, we're sequestering a lot of carbon year on year in the landscape now, does not necessarily mean that if we continue to do what we're doing across Maine, that we're going to continue to sort of succeed at meeting those types of rates. So this is a huge slide to suggest we do need to do what the governor's task force is looking at. We do need to do additional analyses. We need to think of new incentives and better incentives, better ways to get people in the woods and sort of do more management. As I noted, there's a number of practices that we're looking at, things like extending the rotation from 50 to 100 years, so letting trees grow a lot basically longer before we even think about cutting them, changing the distribution of how much we do of clear cutting versus partial harvesting and identifying what the impact may be with that. Acknowledging that we could probably get trees to grow faster if we do some sort of planting as opposed to sort of the standard natural regeneration that you do in Maine. Maybe increasing the amount of reserve land base to have more set-asides and ecological reserve, particularly for those really sort of sensitive areas that maybe are really carbon rich. Number 5 is looking at sort of a mix of a lot of these things in what we call the triad approach, which is sort of intensive for set-aside forestry and sort of a mix of sort of more of like what's carrying on with business as usual. And then also looking at this idea of basically pinpointing areas that might be susceptible to conversion and putting that under conservation, or finding areas that basically are primarily in pasture or managing marginal crops and afforesting or reforesting them. And so what you do is basically you run the model and you do a whole suite of things behind that, and you come up with basically this figure, which is basically to interpret the bigger the bar, it means the more carbon that's being sequestered year on year, and the more green that the bar is, it means the cheaper it is to do. So ideally what you want is bars that go way to the right and that are basically dark green or light green, right? Those are the ones that are saying you're basically getting your best bang for the buck because you can get a lot of carbon if you do that across the landscape, right? And it's not relatively costly. And so basically anything that's basically in the sort of the greens means it's really cost effective compared to doing solar panels or electrifying the transportation sector or something like that. As you get into the sort of the yellow or the red or the orange, those are things that maybe might be a lot more cost prohibitive, and you might want to think twice about maybe promoting that widely across the state if you're looking at it in terms of from a sort of a state policy perspective. And the key here is that a lot of it is pointing to aspects of where you're basically getting trees to grow faster through planting. but also acknowledging that you can also get a good amount if you also add it, couple the planting with setting stuff, land aside for some ecological reserves. So you're basically doing this happy medium. Doing things like extending rotations, all right, might get you some carbon for a while, but then eventually that stand gets to an age where it's basically eligible to be harvested. And all that means is you're basically, the amount of carbon, the additional carbon you're getting, you're just basically going to cut it and transfer it into products anyway. So it doesn't necessarily get you that much more over the long. The other thing that I want to acknowledge is that there can be, I'm talking in this case, I'm all just looking at costs in carbon. But as we know, there's a suite of sort of benefits that forests can provide, right? And depending on the state of the forest, those can vary. So here, what we're doing is looking at some of those sort of a wide variety of some of these different practices that were found to have at least some positive benefits on the carbon side of thing, but looking at sort of the biodiversity and trade-off sides. And so the key thing here is that if you think about extended rotation, that's going to be great for basically late successional forests, both in terms of hardwoods and spruce fir, which is really good habitat for things like marten. But actually, it's less. The habitat itself is less beneficial to species like Canadian lynx, and then some birds as well. If you do this sort of cutting and planting, all right, that means you're reducing the amount of late successional forest across the landscape. But this sort of more early successional forest is going to be better for other species like lynx. But it's even worse for a number of sort of different types of birds that might thrive on sort of a more distributed landscape. And so the way you can get it then is that really, again, this comes back to the triad, is where if you do a mix of where you have some ecological set-asides, you have some late successional forest, you have some sort of more fast-growing sort of plantation style. And with that, you can mostly see benefits both on the late successional side and the sort of habitat aspect from lynx. But in all cases, we find sort of compared to just the sort of business as usual, partial cut, 50-year-old stand sort of across the landscape, it's less beneficial to birds compared to the status quo. But we do note that basically a lot of the forest is still really good because these are percentage changes from that. So you're still going to see more habitat potential for birds compared to today. It's just less better. It's not as much compared to this business. The other thing, as I noted too, is that we're interested in carbon, we're interested in biodiversity, but the other kind of key thing we get from the woods are harvests, right? They're going to supply sort of our pulp and sawmills. And so this figure is just showing what we've also done is look under different sort of demand needs, how much carbon you could expect to get if you implement those certain practices that I showed on the previous slide, but also the potential loss that you could get in terms of timber reductions compared to today. And what we found is that in some cases, in the sort of middle case, which is mostly what I've been presenting, there might be some where you can at least plant more across the landscape to help make up some of that gap that you could potentially lose in terms of lost timber. But there's other cases where you do things like extend rotations, or if your sort of timber demand goes down and there's less harvesting, right, you're going to see essentially a negative impact on that. So it's acknowledging that there might not necessarily be a win-win-win case when you're trying to basically find all solutions about these management benefits, at least for the scenarios that we've looked at so far. We have another follow-on project that's looking at more nuanced management opportunities that might find some sort of more advantageous practices that we do. The other thing I want to note is that there's the forest economy, there's the sort of the carbon benefits that we're looking at. But it's also ultimately up to landowners and forest managers to actually do things on the ground to actually implement it. So we need to acknowledge that there's different barriers and opportunities as well for people to implement. So one way to think about it is the idea about whether the policies are going to be regulatory or voluntary. So this is whether the state tells you have to implement something, or basically it's going to provide incentives or something like that, where then people can choose whether or not they want to do it. And this is based on a number of focus groups and interviews that we have held with large landowners, small landowners, environmental organizations, et cetera. And basically they found that basically across the board, everyone says a voluntary carbon market or incentive program would be a lot better than having the state basically regulate what practices should be implemented across the forest land. When it comes to sort of more nuanced intermediate treatments, A lot of landowners said they'd like to implement pre-commercial thinning and other sort of intermediate treatments, but they're really cash strapped and they need sufficient financial incentives to do it. They acknowledge that there's improvements to forest health as a result, but if you're doing that practice now, you might not see those financial benefits for 20 or 30 years from now, right? And so when you're concerned about sort of bottom line, you really need to look sort of need additional incentives to implement that now. Small landowners sort of have less sort of technical know-how or additional financial barriers to implement some of these treatments. So we have to do more to sort of raise awareness and get the word out and get some technical assistance out on how to do that. Pretty much small and most large landowners really have a lot of values beyond just revenue and carbon storage, right? And so that's going to limit what options they might consider, including clear cuts, right? So it's really about a multi-objective forest management that we want to think about. And with that, there's public perception, right? So I can go out and I can be this academic up in Orono and say, look, you just clear cut a bunch of land and plant it with fast growing trees. We're going to get all this carbon. It's going to be good for the timber economy, right? But a lot of people are hesitant about that because of sort of issues that we've sort of faced in terms of social license to operate and sort of perception of clear cuts that have been around Maine since the 80s in terms of perception of what these are, right? So people aren't necessarily eager to go back to sort of a 1980s style of management, largely due to sort of public perception. And then everyone's really concerned about a sustainable timber supply, right? And so the concern is that there might be too much emphasis in some of these policies on carbon storage, and that could harm the viability of the timber industry, right? And so you kind of need that timber industry there to continue to manage the forest in certain ways, right? Which is so you just can't just set it all aside. You really need a way to work with industry and policy and environmental groups to find sort of this happy medium to ensure sustainable timber supply, which is then thereby going to lead to sort of healthy and sustainable forest. The other thing I want to note, and I didn't dig into too much in this talk, but we do have to recognize that forests are indeed a natural system, right? And so they're prone to a number of fundamental limits and underappreciated risks, right? And so in Maine, there can be climate stressors. So we are going to see basically shifts in the types of species and the relative growth of different types of species across the state, right? There's biotic agents, including spruce budworm, emerald ash borer, hemlock woody adelgid, right, that are going to affect basically our forests. It's not too much of a concern in Maine in terms of wildfire, but there's always a chance that, again, as ecosystems and climate change, that could become more of an issue. And then again, with anything human disturbance and what we as humans, how we treat the forest, are also going to have an impact. And so, my results can look nice and robust, but we have to acknowledge that there could be there's a number of different threats and limits to trying to deal with a natural ecosystem that can make it sort of more challenging than just putting some sort of environmental technology in a smokestack or just converting everyone's cars to electric power, right? Or from that perspective. So I basically, we're coming to an end here, but I did talk sort of at the beginning that we had this Forest Carbon Task Force. Some of the work that I've done is sort of fed into that. And I think Barrie and Tracy are both going to talk about some different aspects that sort of on ways that they manage, or they either work with landowners or manage their own land. But I do want to acknowledge that a lot of what I've talked about is really aligned with some of the forest management strategies that have come out of the task force's recommendation, which is things like incentivizing forest conservation, focusing on ways that manage competition and regenerating the site quickly with suitable species after a harvest. Focus on reducing risk of disturbances to the best you can, increase stocking and understock stands, but also thin immature or even overstock stands, which can stimulate growth and yield. Focus when you do harvest, get more of that into longer lived wood products, right, that aren't sort of decay as fast. Minimize stand damage, do some intensive silvicultural treatments on high productivity sites. And when you do harvest, focus on sort of climate-friendly, sustainable practices. And for those really sort of areas with really high carbon density and special ecological value, we want to establish reserves. So to summarize, so Maine's forests, as I noted, are a really large part of meeting our state's greenhouse gas targets. we can become net zero by 2045 relatively easily by maintaining our current rate of about 10 or more million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, as long as the greenhouse gas emissions continue to follow the trajectory downward, which is sort of another part of the state's mandate. And forests can easily sequester 4 or more million metric tons per year above those baseline rates that I've noted. To get there, we really want to think about doing a diverse set of management practices that could be implemented across Maine. And those should work on both mitigating greenhouse gases, enhancing forest carbon sinks, but also dealing with climate risk. But we need to note that this is geographically and resource dependent. So doing something down in, Warren or Freedom or Jefferson might not be the same thing that you want to do up in the county, right? And so we need to acknowledge that as well, because different species, different landowner types, different resources that are available. Large and small landowners can both contribute to a solution. So this isn't just about like, let's let the large landowners sort of deal with it. You can do something on your woodlot to help sort of contribute. But to do this really, widespread adaptation and mitigation is really going to require financial incentives and technical assistance to get this widespread. And so with that, I thank you. I note that basically, if you want to know more and go into the sort of real sort of deep end in terms of all the stuff behind all these calculations that I show, you can basically Google Maine Natural Climate Solutions Initiative, and you'll come up with a whole suite of sort of reports and things like that. Just want to thank everyone who's basically contributed to this, and really, feel free to contact me if you have more information. I know we're going to speak a little bit more, as part of a panel, but hopefully that, teed it up for Barrie and Tracy to sort of hit on some, some other sort of key things that we might want to know in this space when it comes to forest carbon and the state. Thank you.
Yeah, Adam, thank you so much. That was certainly very interesting and informative, and I'm sure there'll be some questions later on for you. Next, we're going to hear from Barrie Brusila of Mid-Maine Forestry. You heard a little bit about it before, but I'm going to embellish on that a little bit. So please bear with me. So Barrie did attend Wesley College once upon a time. She has a BS in Forest Management from UMO and an MS in Forestry from UMO as well. As was mentioned, she's an associate supervisor with the district, was a supervisor for a long time with us. And she owns Mid-Maine Forestry with husband Mitch. She's been a consultant forester for many years. And the business involves performing a variety of services for non-industrial landowners, including individuals, families, towns, and land trusts. Work includes woodlot reconnaissance, forest management plans, timber inventory, timber marketing, stumpage sale administration and supervision, and timber stand improvement. She works in cooperation with state and federal agencies in administering forest land cost share programs as well. As I said, she established Mid-Maine Forestry in January 1995. And Mid-Maine Forestry is a certified resource manager certified by SCS Global Services to Forest Stewardship Council standards since 1998. And she's also under contract with the Baxter State Park and managed the Austin Cary Forest, a property they own in Harpswell from 1999 to now. In a special pilot project in Maine, she provided forest management services through the county conservation district to cooperatives and other landowners in Somerset County. Special projects have included organizing the forestry demonstration area for Maine Farm Days back in 1987 and developing a master plan for the Yankee Woodlot, demonstration woodlot with the multi-agency steering committee. She's conducting periodic forestry tours and public speaking, has done a lot of that for public relations and done a lot of educational types of work. So she's done many other kinds of work, had many affiliations. You heard about some of them earlier, and I won't go into all of them now because, again, we'd be here all night if I were to continue with most of that. But Barry's now going to discuss how sustainable forestry correlates with sequestering forest carbon and the specific practices and activities that are recommended in the Forest Carbon Program Task Force report. So Barry, I hope I said what exactly you're going to be talking about. So take it away and we shall find out.
Basically you did, and thanks for that nice introduction, Mark. I'm going to talk fairly specifically about the task force and some of the recommendations that we came up with. Adam gave a good introduction to it. The task force is basically an outcome of the Maine Climate Council's Natural and Working Lands group, the recommendation to have this committee that focused on forest carbon. And our directive was to develop incentives to encourage forest land management practices that increase carbon storage, specifically on ownerships of 10 to 10,000 acres, while maintaining harvest levels overall. So basically our focus is or was on the small landowners rather than some of the larger land holdings up north. I think there's a lot of overlap. There's a kind of a similar effort going on for larger landowners, but our focus was on the ownerships of 10 to 10,000 acre ownerships. And the thing about maintaining harvest levels overall, Adam mentioned that too, is if we just did a bunch of set-asides and said that we're going to just sequester, we're just going to store carbon and not really bother sequestering it, the cut is going to go someplace else, whether it's someplace else in another state or another region of the country or perhaps another part of the world. So the idea is to improve the management of our forest and at least sustain the harvest levels that we've been doing to support our industry, and just to do that by improving forest practices. So we had three basically overarching principles that we identified. One is maintaining existing forest land, and Maine loses about 10,000 acres a year to basically development, and that's land that is not going to be forested again, or it's not going to be farmland again, as opposed to land that might get clear cut. It's going to be growing back to forest. So that's kind of a distinction, is losing acres to development, and that's something that we definitely wanted to focus on and decrease that number. And Adam talked quite a bit about carbon sequestration and storage, and they're both important. Sequestration can be achieved through carbon-friendly forest practices, and storage can be achieved through delayed harvest. That's a very simplified approach to it, but that's something we talked a lot about in the committee. And I just wanted to back up and say for a minute that I felt kind of intimidated getting onto this committee, thinking there's a lot of people on it that knew a lot more about this than I did. So I had a steep learning curve, and I have learned a lot. And I'm, trying to keep it down to a basic level. A lot of landowners I find are very interested in this, but don't quite know where to start or where to turn. And I basically learned during my time in the committee that it's clear that there's a strong correlation between sound, sustainable forestry and effective carbon sequestration and storage. There's not like there's one particular forest management practice that's going to be the be all and end all and save everything. If we really continue to improve our management and do a little bit more intensive forestry and caretaking of our forests, that we'll be able to maintain, or if not even increase the harvest cut while improving the management and the health of the forest. So one of our directives was to identify a suite of climate-friendly forest management practices that improve carbon stocks and maintain current harvest levels. So anyway, Adam had that same list on his PowerPoint and went through it quite quickly. And I made a very brief PowerPoint. I'm not as proficient as making nice PowerPoints as Adam is or Louisa is. So I will apologize in advance for that. And Julie is going to run that for me. And I'm just going to go through and kind of, again, talk about the parallel between good sustainable forest practices and what we're trying to do to improve carbon. So on the first on the list here, manage competition from invasives and undesirable tree species. Louisa did a very good job of talking about the invasive plant work that she's doing. And that really has an effect on forests because it can have an extreme effect on forest regeneration. So that's an increasing problem, and not just the plants, but also the invasive pests like the hemlock woolly adelgid and the emerald ash borer. And we had quite a bit of discussion under the phrase undesirable tree species. These bullet points that I have here are from our draft report, and it's going to be a little bit changed probably to the final report. To me, undesirable tree species, which means tree species are not suitable to the site where they're growing. So you want to basically have native tree species and ones that are suitable for the soils and site where they're growing. And if we're relying on natural regeneration, which we do with many harvests, plan the harvest to regenerate the site quickly, which means create conditions to grow the type of trees you want to have. And that's basically good silvics and silviculture. When planting, select species well suited to the site and a changing climate. Again, there's, the certain tree species are predicted to not fare well with the increasing temperature, changing weather patterns and that sort of thing. Some tree species are predicted to do better. And then there's certain generalist trees, like red maple is one for an example, which does well in a whole variety of conditions. And then the next bullet item, plan to reduce the risk of carbon losses from disturbances. And that's wildfire, insect infestations, that sort of thing. So basically to plan for contingencies. And as we're going into the future here, there's a lot of changes that are happening that are out of our control. The weather is one thing, but we're doing the best we can with all that. So the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so conducting intermediate treatments. This is basically thinning in overstock stands, doing some improvement thinning and that kind of thing. And conduct thinning and in understock stands, immature and overstock stands to stimulate the growth of the remaining trees, and pre-commercial thinning of saplings and small poles. So basically we're talking about intermediate treatments that aren't done as much now as they could be. So another thing that is really goes along with this, one of the third, getting back to the third overarching principles, I forgot to mention the third one there, is the adoption of carbon enhancing forest practices depends on the existence of dependable, economically viable markets for low grade wood. So we can talk a lot about all these wonderful thinnings and things we should be doing in the forest, but if we can't sell the low grade wood, the job just won't happen. Or what will happen instead is harvesting of the high quality trees, which are often the trees you want to be leaving for carbon sequestration or future durable wood products. So that's something we talked a lot about in the committee, is the need for having better markets for these low grade products. And right now, the immediate situation is we have a very poor market for softwood pulp, for example, white pine pulpwood. And in our part of the state where we live here, we have a lot of that, and it often gets cut in improvement harvests of trees of all sorts of sizes. But if you can't sell it, the job's not going to get done. So that's part of what we talked about in the committee, is to do what we can to improve the markets for that. And part of the recommendations that we came up with too was for the Maine Forest Service to have a marketing and utilization forester, which they had for years. Some of you may remember Pete Lammert, who lives in Thomaston, who served that role. And we've also talked about having an increasing role for the Maine Forest Service in conducting a forest carbon program. Okay, I diverted a little bit there. Sorry for my tangent. Okay, so again, retaining more carbon in thinnings, retaining large diameter live trees, snags for and species diversity, the diversity of all native species on a given site. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, practicing sustainable harvesting is another category of what we want to do. And to increase the proportion of harvested materials that are likely to be used in long-lived wood products. There's a push now to have more building with wood products, multi-story wood buildings rather than just, you know, single-family homes and that sort of thing. So that's one way of storing carbon for a long time. Certain wood products are kind of not long-term storage, like biomass harvesting, disposable paper products, but increasing the use of long-term wood products is a really good way to store carbon. And managing partial harvest and any kind of harvest really to minimize soil disturbance, because if you saw in Adam's slide that almost 30 or 40% of the carbon is stored in the forest soil. So it's really important to protect that and not disturb it, because the disturbance can often lead to a loss of carbon. And to focus investments in intensive treatments and sites with high carbon value, which is basically working on your best sites the same way you would with an agricultural product, to put your investments into the best sites. And extending harvest cycles to that would increase carbon storage for a longer time, and also to grow wood products that will be more long-lived. And also to utilize timber harvesting professionals, loggers that are trained in all these different aspects of climate-friendly forestry like we're talking about. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about actual, you know, what to do in the woods, and these are a couple of other categories of practices that the task force focused on. Again, getting back to the concept of avoiding forest conversion. And we talked a lot about that through different things: conservation easements, fee purchases. And another thing that the task force was tasked with talking about and coming up with recommendations for is changes to the open space tax law, and how that might be altered to increase landowner participation and allowing forest carbon sequestration on their lands, and then subsequently getting a property tax benefit for doing that. It's kind of like a version of the current use taxation program, but it will need to be a little bit more long-term to actually have true value. And then getting back again to the problem of losing of forest land is establishing forest reserves. And forest reserves are also good. It's in the balance of forest management. You want to have some lands that are managed and some that are just basically set aside as reserves. And some landowners are quite focused on one or another. I find that in this part of the world that a lot of the landowners want to do a little bit of both on their land. And that's really, in the end, that's a good balanced approach to it. And then, again, this should all be incentivized through existing voluntary programs, and as I mentioned, the open space current use taxation program and changes that are kind of ongoing on that. So I guess I will stop there. I think I've probably run out of time and pass the torch on to Tracy, I guess back to Mark to introduce Tracy. Thank you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Good. Barrie, thanks so much. That was very, very interesting, and potentially very useful, I think, too. So next is Tracy Moskovitz. Now, Tracy established Hidden Valley Nature Center with his wife Bambi Jones some time ago, and his personal and professional life was shaped by the very first Earth Day back in 1970 and all the events that led up to it. That's when Tracy decided to get an environmental engineering degree and then a law degree. So since then, he's been hard at work trying to save the planet by thinking and acting locally and globally. So his first 11 years in Maine were spent working at the Maine Public Utilities Commission, initially as an attorney, then as head of the technical division, and finally as a commissioner. He was a vital part of a PUC that creatively moved Maine to the forefront of sustainable energy policy. Upon leaving the PUC in 1989, he was a founder of the Regulatory Assistance Project, usually called RAP, R-A-P for short. So RAP is an independent, nonpartisan, non-governmental organization dedicated to accelerating the transition to a clean, reliable, and efficient energy future. The RAP has grown to become a global organization with full-time offices around the US, Europe, China, and India. He started RAP's China program and led it for more than a decade. Now, currently, Tracy devotes about 25% of his time to RAP, primarily focused on developing new policy initiatives. So closer to home, his environmental commitment, which is, as I said, shared by his wife, Bambi Jones, of over 40 years, is reflected in their organic farm and local, state, and national award-winning sustainable forestry practices. In 2010, Bambi and Tracy created Hidden Valley Nature Center and operated it on 1,000 acres of very special land in Jefferson. So Hidden Valley Nature Center quickly became a treasured community resource valued by all that experienced it. In 2014, Tracy and Bambi's farm and nature center were named Maine and the Northeast region's outstanding tree farm for their decades of sustainable forestry practices and their related outreach and educational efforts. In 2016, Hidden Valley Nature Center was part of a four-way merger that created Midcoast Conservancy. So Tracy is going to provide a landowner's perspective and how their forest has changed over time. So Tracy, thanks so much for being with us tonight. And we know this is going to be a very interesting and informative talk.
Thanks, Mark. And I can guarantee you and everyone else that the talk is going to be a little bit shorter than the introduction. So hopefully we'll get there. So the hat I'm wearing tonight is really my landowner hat. And as Mark said, and Barrie knows full well, I've been actively engaged in forestry here in the state of Maine and on our land for over 40 years, and was lucky enough with Barrie's help. Barrie, you should know, is our forester. Was lucky enough to have won the Tree Farm of the Year award for Maine and the Northeast region. That was a great honor, and we had lots of fun. But I really want to just talk for a few minutes about bringing home to even one more level toward the dirt from using Barrie's talk. And we learned a lot about how to increase carbon in the forest, and it's basically growing better trees, growing faster, growing more trees, growing bigger trees, increasing basically the stocking level. As Adam also said, I've sort of been on the edges, around the edges of the Carbon Task Force, and I like to say contributed a lot to its work. I was fascinated there. I mean, like Barrie, I tend to think of things pretty simply, and it's the task was to increase the amount of carbon. What are the carbon opportunities to increase carbon storage in forests? And then with this proviso, it's while maintaining harvest. If you're going to maintain harvest and increase stock and increase carbon, it really means you got to increase growth. And what do you do to increase growth? You do all of those things that Barrie had on her slides. You do all those good silvicultural practices. I think even though we spent a lot of time, and I definitely have tried to dig into what would you do in your forest if what you really had as your primary goal to increase the amount of carbon you can store, assuming then you're also going to spread those practices regionally and hopefully globally. It really is the practices that we've been engaged in for the last 40 years. That we've been engaged in, that Barrie has identified. It's those relatively simple things: pre-commercial thinning, keeping your eye on how things are growing, dealing with any disease, dealing with places that aren't performing very well, and seeing what you can do to make them perform better. Dealing with the invasives, so you have the space and resources to grow the kind of trees you really want to grow. Now, one of the other hats, I'm going to show just one or two slides here. One of the other hats that I wear that I think Mark didn't mention, I'm also on the board of New England Forestry Foundation, and they have been an active participant in the Carbon Task Force. New England Forestry Foundation has identified a set of practices and embodied them in the standards that they call the exemplary forestry standards. They're pretty simple, pretty straightforward. They really involve all of the things that Barrie and Adam talked about for the kind of practices you would employ. But because it's standards, it also has, this is what we're sort of aiming for. So just as a, as a rough place to start, the average forest in Maine, I think statewide, is probably about 17 or 18 cords an acre. If you practice exemplary forestry standards as defined by the New England Forestry Foundation, the stocking levels would be close to twice that, 25 to 30 cords per acre. When you take stocking levels from, let's say, 15 cords an acre to 30 cords an acre, you've doubled the amount of carbon that you have on the ground. It doesn't even take into account yet the fact that during that time you've been harvesting, and some of the material you've been harvesting goes into long-lived wood products. Let me just share this screen. I'm hoping you can all now see a little bar chart there that says exemplary forestry standards results. This is work from New England Forestry Foundation. They've been in existence for 75 years now, and I think they've managed probably they're the third largest land trust in the nation, and have well over 1 million acres under conservation. But they manage their forest lands, or the bulk of their forest lands. This chart sort of shows what's happened to a typical land that New England Forestry Foundation has managed. They've managed them to these exemplary forestry standards, and they've done it for the long term. Each of the groups of bar charts is a different woodlot, essentially. I think 2 of them are in Maine, 2 or 3 are in New Hampshire, 1 in Massachusetts. The first bar chart, I think I'll use my pointer a little bit. This sort of tells you in each case for the first bar for each woodlot, shows you the stocking level when they first acquired the land, and which in some cases was over 30 years ago. So you'll see the figures range from a high of 23 cords per acre to a low of, looks like about 1 cord an acre, 1.6 cords an acre, something that was essentially clear cut. The second bar shows the stocking levels after 30 years. So what you really want to do is look at what's happened between the time they acquired the land and 30 years later. In every single case, they've increased, in some cases dramatically increased, the stocking level. The third chart, the third bar, is what they harvested over that 30 years. So they didn't just buy the land and let it sit for 30 years and measure how much the wood grew. They were managing the woods with the practices that Barrie and Adam described, with an aim toward fully stocking the forest, growing bigger trees, growing better quality trees, increase the size range so that more and more of the wood was going into saw timber and not pulpwood. You can see what the products are in the various colors in that last bar. And what it says is that they've been harvesting steadily over that time period while growing trees faster and increasing the stocking level. If this level of management were applied regionally, I'm sorry, not even regionally, if this level of management was applied in Maine everywhere for every acre, here is what you'd get. This is a different cut at some of the numbers that Adam had, but the big triangle, the big number at the end is that's how much carbon we've got to get out of the air by 2050. This 30% solution refers to what we can get out of forests. I'll give you a different version of it. The forest, improved forest management practices and keeping forests as forest and putting some wood into buildings and replacing steel and concrete in larger buildings provides about 30% of everything that that New England needs. It's Maine forest providing 30% of everything New England needs to reach the New England target. That's pretty impressive. You know, that's just as I was told the other day, I haven't checked this myself, so don't hold me to it, but in total, this represents these improved forest management practices. It represents, you know, roughly 650 million metric tons of carbon mitigation. That compares, you know, we have the very, you know, now controversial CMP Hydro-Quebec purchase. Over the 30-year life of that project, it's expected to save 40 million metric tons. You know, so compare 40 to 646, and you see that the potential we have for increasing carbon storage in our forest is probably, I don't know of anything we can do that's bigger. It's not a silver bullet that doesn't do everything, but I don't know of any single thing we can do that's bigger than improve forest management practices. Now, the last thing I just want to tell you before I stop is one of the most exciting parts of all of this is Adam and Barrie's both talked about the fact that we need more technical assistance, we need more landowner incentives. Basically, and Adam had his nice chart showing you how a lot of carbon practices, forest-related carbon practices, were cost-effective, but they weren't free. They cost money. Where does the money come from? Well, I don't really expect Governor Mills to reach into the general fund and provide many millions of dollars to provide landowner incentives to do better forest management. But there is a place, and that's the carbon markets. There are carbon markets that are out there. They're in effect now, and there's both regulatory markets that we have in New England for power plants. There's regulatory markets that we have in California that includes forest practices that you can do in Maine. So there's at least 3 or 4 large areas of Maine, large landowners that have sold carbon into the carbon market as a way to underwrite or subsidize their forest management practices in Maine. The trick is, and this is one of the real areas of focus for the Carbon Task Force, was what to do for small landowners. Because right now, entering the carbon market is a complicated and costly process, something that I can't just call my favorite forester, Barrie, and say, Barrie, would you please sign me up for some carbon in the carbon market? She can do me a lot of good and help me a lot signing up for the similar kinds of programs that NRCS offers now. But to get into the carbon market really requires something far beyond what we've done now. And the Carbon Task Force has recommended, as really that's the primary goal of their all of their work, was to find ways to produce a carbon program that helps small landowners, defined as under 10,000 acres, to enter the carbon market, tap the carbon market to provide them the resources they need to do better forest management. And that is a recommendation of the Carbon Task Force. It's to work with existing brokers to find opportunities that the state may have in partnership with those brokers to fashion programs available for small woodland owners. That's what I think of it as being phase 2 of the carbon task force work. Hopefully when the report's final and accepted by the governor, that the result will be that she embraces the recommendation of the task force to engage in that second phase. And the result of that will be that us as small landowners will have another tool available to us. As I said, now I know I use NRCS programs almost all the time, but I would do so much more if we had the opportunity to sell carbon into the carbon market. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about there, currently the price of carbon in voluntary carbon markets, I'm going to just ballpark them, around $10 a ton of CO2. $10 a ton for CO2 is roughly $25 a cord of wood. It's a rather significant sum of money if we can find a way to tap the market and demonstrate to the purchasers of carbon that we're able to manage our forests in ways that increase the amount of carbon. We're only going to get paid for the carbon that we can increase. So we got to increase our rate of sequestration, increase carbon storage before we can hope to sell it to the market. But once we can sell it to the market, that's a fairly attractive price on day one. And everybody in the planet believes that the carbon market price is going to go from its current value of about $10 to $50 at least in the next 10 years. So that's a pretty hefty increase you can expect in carbon. So while other things in the woods may be steady or maybe not even worth as much, the one product all of us are producing every day with our woods is carbon. We have the ability to be better carbon farmers now. It's not that hard. And this is a market where the value of the carbon we grow is just escalating. I'm going to close with just one last comment. Adam's charts were very good about essentially telling us the story that Maine can sort of sleepwalk its way to meeting Maine's goal. We don't have to do that much because we're blessed with all these great forests, and almost if we just sort of stumble along the way we're going now, we'll comfortably meet the governor's goals. But we always have to remind ourselves that the planet's not going to respond if Maine meets its goals and the rest of the planet doesn't. We really have an opportunity in Maine to go well beyond meeting our own carbon goals and really contributing to the carbon goals that hopefully the U.S. will set and the world needs. So we should be doing as much as we can here and not just trying to meet our goal. Just where I'll leave it. So thanks a lot.
Tracy, thanks so much. Thanks so much. That's very interesting and certainly some very important information that we all need to know about. And it's very clear that all of you folks, all of you speakers have been doing a lot already for educating folks related to carbon sequestration, carbon storage, and which is really important for forest landowners and other landowners to take into account and really be thinking about that, and not only thinking about it, to be trying to do something about it. And as you said, Tracy, finding funding to do a lot of these things is not always easy, but yet it's an important thing that needs to be done. So all of you have certainly demonstrated a lot of leadership in this certainly area that's certainly invaluable, and it's going to provide, I think, a lot of encouragement to these forest owners to maybe step up to the plate a little more, so to speak, and adopt more of these practices. Are going to be really important for us in the future. As you said, it's going to be a lot of years down the road where it's going to take to do this, but we certainly have to start. It has been starting, but there's a lot more to do. As you said too, the price of carbon is $10, but if it goes to $50 down the road, that certainly should make a big difference as well. So I think that's Julie. We have some questions that have come in along the way here that
Actually, I have been monitoring the chat and I don't see any questions at this point. If anyone in the audience has a question, you can either physically raise your hand. You could go down to reactions and raise your hand that way.
Sure.
Let's see, or I could ask everyone to unmute if that that might be a little messy, but
Comments, questions?
Speakers were very thorough.
Yes, well, actually they were. They answered many of my questions that I had.
Yes.
Great.
So.
No more questions? Jay.
Nancy, did you have a question? Oh, so from Carol Weymouth, this is for Barrie, and then I also see Nancy has a question. Barrie, for low value wood, might biochar be an option for sales plus improve ag soil health? And Barrie, you need to be unmuted, so I'm asking you to unmute. Oh, okay, I'm doing it again.
Okay, I need to have you unmute me. I have heard of biochar. I don't know that much about it. I know I have one logger who's been looking into it. I don't know that it would be a great big panacea for our problem, but anything we can do is a help. That's something I wish I knew more about, but I don't. But it does have potential, like I said, but probably not on a big scale.
I can speak a little bit on that because the study that I did talk about, we didn't just look at forestry side of things, we looked on ag side of things too. And one of them that we were charged with looking at was the actual potential for biochar. In terms of bottom line, it looks like there's a lot of potential there if you can make it work and make things line up. So it has the ability to do a lot in terms of as a soil sort of amendment to enhance soil carbon, particularly on ag land. Right, we have an abundance of biomass, so we can do it there. The key is that there are a couple of things. One is that we need the technology to actually like efficiently convert the biomass into biochar. There is the prospect of, at least up in East Millinocket, that they've at least proposed or put forward an announcement that they are going to build a biochar plant up there. But in terms of talking with farmers, there's still a bit of hesitation about wanting to take something that they don't know a lot about and just start scattering it across their fields, right? So I think there's still going to have to be some technical assistance, even if we can make the numbers line up to sort of get that demand side going. But there's definitely people thinking about it. There's the potential there. But as Barrie said, it's not going to be a panacea, but there could be something there. It's definitely not something to I think ignore.
Yeah, Adam, can you speak to the energy cost of producing that biochar in terms of its ultimate value as a soil amendment and so on? There's been a number of webinars produced on biochar over the last year or so. I've seen some of them, but I still have that question about it. Seems like it takes a lot of energy to produce that stuff.
Yeah, it does. I guess where the bottom line helps there is that we have an abundance of wood that can serve as the energy, right? So as long as it doesn't cost a lot for the feedstock, you can use part of the feedstock just to actually do the combustion, because you have to raise it. It's like, you have to get temperatures up to 700, 800 degrees Fahrenheit for the process to happen. Yes. So you do have to have a lot of input to produce the output, but my understanding is these relatively, new and efficient technologies can utilize that to some degree, but it's definitely a concern that if you're wasting a bunch of energy and resources just to make it, then it might not be as efficient as again, someone like me as an academic could come out and say, oh yeah, just everyone should do it. Yeah, great point, Mark.
Nancy has a question. Then I also know that Andrew Johnson has a question in the chat, and I'm asking Nancy to unmute. There, okay.
Thank you. I couldn't type fast enough here. Adam, we're neighbors. I live across the street from you up there. I'm pretty certain. And
yeah, you do.
I'm that missing neighbor.
You're down in Southport right now, though.
I am down on Southport.
Okay.
The reason I wanted to bring this up is that a previous forestry person at UMaine had expressed some interest in a family woodlot that's down in Hamden that's currently not really being managed. And there was some interest in potentially using it as a demonstration site. And in listening to Tracy's presentation, I didn't realize, Tracy, that's how Mary Spring was developed. I'm new on the commission here, I'm learning. I'm wondering if that Hamden site might be something that the university forestry area would like to look into. And if so, could I put you in touch with the family member?
Yep. So we're for a number of different reasons, we're always at UMaine within Forest. We're always interested in working with people that have woodlots that basically are looking for management input. And so it can be anywhere from actual faculty members to seniors needing to work on their capstones. I know we've done some work out in Hamden. Whether or not we went to that one or not, I don't know. But yeah, reach out to me and I'll make the connections and we'll see where we can go.
I'd really appreciate that. When it came up before, it was about 5 or 6 years ago, and I know that person since retired. So I'll leave a note on your door one of these days. How's that?
Okay, fantastic. Thanks.
Good to see you, and thank you all. That was outstanding. I have a lot to learn in the forestry area, and the explanation Adam gave of the how we capture this carbon, but then the practical parts both Barrie and Tracy gave in terms of what does it mean and how's it happen on the land really meant a lot. Thank you. So I look forward to sharing this replay. I'll get a link from Julie. Thank you all.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks. And this is to all the speakers. This is from, or whoever wants to answer. This is from Andrew Johnson, who typed in the chat, would pruning limbs increase the chance of timber being used for durable, long-lasting products and therefore have a carbon storage benefit?
I'll try to tackle that one. I mean, the tree pruning historically was a practice that NRCS paid people for. They discontinued that as a cost share practice, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And the idea was to basically increase timber value and saw log value in the future, and therefore, longer lived wood products. I think probably in a practical sense, it never really made a big change in that because it's a very long-term investment. Land changes hands. Landowners don't necessarily keep records of the trees that they pruned. And so the translation process that needs to happen from the actual pruning of trees to a sawmill acknowledging that there's higher value lumber and they're going to pay more for it. I don't really know that that's happened. I mean, sawmills will occasionally pay more for, or sometimes pay more for saw timber, but they usually do it by doing a walk on the ground and looking at the trees. So that might be a way to do it, but it's not really a dependable thing. The good thing about pruning trees, and this is kind of an aside from carbon, it's a very simple practice that landowners can do with a very simple tool. It gets people out and gets them engaged with their woods. And that has a lot of value, not necessarily directly related to carbon, but it's a very valuable practice in that way. And it can lead to other beneficial activities and stewardship of the woods.
Thank you, Barrie. Does anyone have any other questions? Either in the chat or raise your hand. Let's see. So Carol Weymouth, a couple more. All right, so Carol Weymouth has written in the chat, and I'm more than welcome to unmute anyone if you would prefer to say your own question. But so Carol says, not surprising to hear that voluntary forest management is prioritized by landowners, but I'd not heard of climate-friendly loggers/foresters. Is that a certification some forestry professionals are getting? Is that?
I'll tackle that one again. Yeah, there's a couple of different groups in Maine that work with loggers with various certifications. One is the Certified Logging Professionals Program. The other is Master Logger, the Professional Logging Contractors of Maine. So the idea being is the loggers are the ones who actually are the boots on the ground that are going to be implementing all this stuff that we talk about. And to have them be more aware of these different practices. And kind of an example is, a similar example is best management practices, which is something that a lot of loggers have been trained in, and that's had a direct positive benefit on the resource, on protecting soil and water quality. So I think we're looking at a kind of a similar thing for carbon friendly practices. And it's, like I said before, it's nothing new and earth shattering compared to what we've done in the past, but to have loggers train more in that. And again, it gets into the whole issue of, you know, who's going to pay the loggers to go to this training, who's going to check them. And that's all very much still under discussion and in the works right now. A lot of foresters get training in this sort of thing anyway now. So I think it's probably focused mostly on loggers, but there are some foresters that have to be kind of brought into the present and future as well.
Thank you, Barrie. Annette has a question. Could you explain at a macro level, how is buying carbon credits different from the issue you discussed earlier, leakage, meaning how is selling carbon through good forest management practices to those who are using carbon different from Maine not harvesting timber and timber being harvested in a neighboring state, in parentheses leakage, and we're not sure if that was phrased.
Yeah, so I'll try to get at what I think you're asking, Annette, and then if I'm not getting there, then we can try this again. So exactly that. So why are we thinking? So just step back at the macro level. Why are we thinking about wanting to incentivize anyone in Maine to change their behavior to enhance forest stocks? Well, it's because this idea that Maine needs to, if we're just focusing on Maine, I agree actually with what Tracy was saying. Ultimately, you want everyone across the world to figure out how to reduce greenhouse gases. But again, within the state, the objective is to try to, basically have us be 80% below greenhouse gas, below 1990 levels in our emissions by 2050, and be neutral, which means reducing emissions and having more carbon sequestration to be net neutral by 2045. In carbon markets, where Tracy was saying, oh, you can get $10 per ton of carbon, those markets are there because there's some entity, whether it's another state or a power plant or a corporation, that basically also has their own goal to want to basically reduce their emissions. But maybe they don't have the ability to reach whatever their goal is just by basically putting in a new technology, right? So what they're doing is they'll be willing to pay for these offsets for a Maine landowner to basically change their behavior and get additional carbon above and beyond what their business as usual is. So to qualify truly for this offset, there's sort of three conditions that are really of much concern. So one is what I just said is additions, or additionality, which means you're actually doing something above and beyond what you would do if you weren't getting paid. So that's the first case. So you have to somehow, to some degree, prove that, right? And you'll get paid for that additional amount that you're doing. The second is that you do need to account for this permanence issue, right? And so I talked about sort of natural ecosystems that we're dealing with, right? Can mean that you could have a fire that come through, or a spruce budworm could come through again, and maybe that might reduce some of the benefits that you're getting. And so that's what's called permanence, right? You can permanently sort of, reduce amount of emissions coming out of a smokestack, harder to do on trees because of just the natural phenomenon. And the third aspect is this leakage component, which is the idea is that you need to also somehow come up with a way to say that if you're changing your harvest behavior, you need to acknowledge that some of that behavior is going to change somewhere else because markets are just not completely going to pay. So at the macro level, the way that these credits are sort of formed or generated, in theory, it accounts for some of these issues, which is supposed to account for the fact that things are happening at different points in the landscape or different points in time that might sort of put some additional stress or caveats or conditions on whatever this offset or carbon credit is that you're generating. I'm not sure if exactly that's what you're getting at, but the key is what I'm trying to get at is that there's sort of different components, and these three major ones are the ones that actually go into whether or not really a project is good, or the amount of sequestration that you're doing from changing your management should truly get fully credited towards whatever program you're looking for.
And let's see, I think David has, or Tracy, you have your hand up, and Annette, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute just to see if you have any clarifying questions. And she did type in the chat, that is helpful. Yes, it is what I was asking. So.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. That was, can you see me now? Oh, yeah.
Yep.
I'm sorry, in the
Yeah.
dark. Yeah, thank you very much.
Ned, even though you're satisfied with the answer, I'm going to add just a little bit to it.
Yeah, good, Tracy. I was rambling there, so please.
Well, it is a tricky thing, I think, because there's always that discussion if you're doing additionality by doing something more than you would otherwise do, but it's at the cost of someone else
It's
emitting. What's the gain? So
yeah. And for the, I'll just mention two things. One, for the work of the Carbon Task Force, we began with one simple given, and that was, can we increase carbon while maintaining harvest levels? That clause, while maintaining harvest levels, is pretty critical, and it's the clause that essentially says we acknowledge and are dealing with leakage. So as long as we, in the aggregate, maintain our harvest levels, nobody next door or out of state or out of country needs to make up for the fact that we stopped harvesting. It's much more of an issue if you if you think of our land trust world, where you want to put land into a reserve or forever wild kind of condition, so you're not harvesting. If you did that on a widespread basis, if you did on a widespread basis, any carbon increase on the forest reserves that you would get by growing, you would have to, and the carbon markets would require that there would be a leakage adjustment, which would say, all right, you're not harvesting on this 1,000 acres, but that's going to have to be made up by somebody else. And so we will adjust for that in some fashion. So you won't get credit for all of the carbon that you've increased on that forest reserve. What we did with the Carbon Task Force is we're looking at it in the aggregate. So in the aggregate, we can increase, we can add some reserves, which are great for all sorts of reasons. But in the aggregate, taking into account the fact that we've taken those acres out of production, in the aggregate, we have to maintain harvest levels. And that's the key to keeping the leakage adjustment. We deal with it. If we didn't deal with it, you might think you had 10 tons of carbon to sell, but the market would really maybe only recognize 4 or 5 or 6.
thank you.
Good seeing you.
You too.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. Oh, another question in the chat, and from Mort. Adam, if 30% of harvested products go into long-term storage, can that number be increased?
Yeah, for sure. So you can sort of change the distribution of what we're harvesting and what type of products they go into, right? So, we talked about maybe still maintaining the harvest, but getting a higher proportion of that harvest in saw log. That's going to take some time to build up and get that, right? But the more you do in sort of longer lasting products, the higher that number will go. So, the 30% is sort of an average across all the products that are produced in Maine. If you can get more of that pulp grade into longer lasting products, or a higher proportion to saw logs, all that stuff will last, in theory, 50 to 100 years, right? Which is going to be a lot more than if we're just making, turning pulp into package board or reams of paper or something like that.
Let me add
about it. Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. More those exemplary forestry standards that NEF has, essentially one of the key elements of them is to do just what Adam said, is increase the size, shift the size distribution. So more and more of your product is in the saw timber and less in the pulp area. They've combined that with, they have a separate sort of build it with wood program, which is really focused on things like developing and expanding the construction of buildings using cross-laminated timbers, where you can get into larger, taller buildings, and that really replaces steel and concrete, both of which are energy intensive. So if you can both increase the proportion of your wood that goes into things like wood building products and shift your building products so that you're not just having more wood, more 2x4s, but you're also using wood to replace steel and concrete, you get extra credit, extra tons that way as well. So if you remember that chart I showed you with lots of little triangles, you know, there was a sliver there for increasing the use of wood in particular to replace steel and concrete for commercial and tall buildings.
Great, thank you. I think I'm not seeing any other questions. Mark, is it okay if I just?
Well, I'll just say thanks so much to our speakers. We certainly value your knowledge and expertise. And if anyone thinks of a question after we leave, perhaps send that to Julie, and I'm sure our speakers would be happy to answer those questions for you. So again, thanks to our speakers, thanks to all the attendees, thanks to our award recipients. They're doing a great job working for conservation in the Knox-Lincoln area and working with the district all the time. We certainly do appreciate that.